If you stay until the end of this video, you will not just understand what happened to Japan's economy. You will understand how power quietly shifts in the modern world, how giants lose weight without collapsing, and how entire regions can rise without a single dramatic headline. This is not a story about sudden crashes. This is a story about slow erosion, silent competition, and the kind of change that only becomes obvious when you zoom out far enough. What you are about to hear will change how you read economic news forever, because you will start seeing what is not being said. In 1995, Japan stood at the peak of modern economic history. Its nominal GDP was about 5.5 trillion US dollars, making it the second largest economy on Earth, behind only the United States. At that moment, Japan's economy alone was larger than the rest of Asia combined. This was not a symbolic victory. It was a structural dominance. Japan controlled capital, technology, supply chains, and industrial standards across the region. When people spoke about Asian economic power in the 1990s, they were often, in practice, speaking about Japan. Tokyo was not just a financial center, it was a command center. Japanese banks were among the largest lenders in the world. Japanese corporations set the pace in automobiles, consumer electronics, precision machinery, and advanced manufacturing. The yen was strong. Japanese firms bought landmark properties in New York and Los Angeles. The global narrative was clear. Japan had mastered the post-war growth model and turned it into a system that looked almost unbeatable. But economic power does not disappear in explosions. It fades in layers. After the early 1990s asset bubble burst, Japan entered what later became known as the lost decades. Growth slowed. Deflation took hold. Asset prices collapsed and never fully recovered to their previous peaks. Productivity gains continued, but demographic gravity began to pull in the opposite direction. A rapidly aging population reduced domestic demand. A shrinking workforce limited long-term expansion. None of this looked dramatic year to year. That is why many people underestimated what was happening. Fast forward to the mid-2020s, and the contrast becomes unavoidable. Japan's nominal GDP in 2025 is around 4.2 to 4.3 trillion US dollars. This is still enormous by any global standard. Japan remains one of the world's largest and most technologically advanced economies. But the relative position has changed. Japan is no longer the dominant Asian economic reference point. The center of gravity has moved. Quietly. Relentlessly. Now comes the comparison that forces perspective. In 2025, the combined GDP of four Chinese coastal economic powerhouses, Jiangsu Province, Shanghai Municipality, Zhejiang Province, and Fujian Province, is estimated at roughly 4.7 trillion US dollars. These four regions alone, not the whole of China, not even half of China, together now produce more nominal economic output than the entire Japanese economy. This is not a symbolic threshold, this is a structural signal. What makes this more striking is not just the size, it is the speed and concentration of growth. These four Chinese regions are deeply integrated into global supply chains. They dominate in manufacturing, logistics, high-tech assembly, e-commerce infrastructure, and export-oriented production. Shanghai functions as a financial and commercial nerve center. Jiangsu and Zhejiang are manufacturing and private enterprise engines. Fujian plays a strategic role in trade and regional integration. Together, they form an economic machine that did not exist at this scale in 1995. In 1995, China as a whole was still a developing economy. Its total GDP was a fraction of Japan's. At that time, the idea that a few Chinese provinces could one day surpass Japan's entire economy would have sounded unrealistic to most analysts. Yet this is exactly what has happened, not through sudden miracles, but through consistent reinvestment, export expansion, urbanization, and deep integration into global trade networks. This shift is not about Japan collapsing. Japan did not fall apart. It stabilized, it optimized, it protected social cohesion, it maintained technological leadership in key niches. But stabilization in a fast-moving world can look like decline when others are sprinting. While Japan focused on managing maturity, China focused on scaling growth. The result is not a dramatic fall for Japan, but a relative repositioning in the hierarchy of economic power. This is how modern economic competition really works. It is not only about who grows, it is about who grows faster, for longer, and at larger scale. Japan's economy matured early. Its population aged early. Its growth model reached saturation earlier. China entered its expansion phase later, but with a population base, industrial scale, and state-backed investment capacity that allowed it to compress decades of growth into a much shorter time window. When you look at the map comparison from 1995 to 2025, what you are really seeing is not a story of failure. You are seeing a story of timing. Japan peaked early in the modern Asian growth cycle. China peaked later, but with far greater scale. This does not make Japan weak. It makes Japan relatively smaller in a world where size, scale, and growth momentum increasingly shape geopolitical and financial influence. This matters because economic size is not just a number. It affects currency power. It affects trade leverage. It affects where capital flows. It affects which markets attract the most innovation. It affects which regions become rule setters rather than rule takers. When 4 Chinese regions together surpass Japan's total output, it signals that decision-making gravity is shifting, even if political systems and alliances do not change overnight. For Japan, this creates a new strategic reality. The country remains wealthy, stable, and technologically advanced, but it now operates in a neighborhood where multiple regional players have economic mass that rivals or exceeds it. This changes negotiation dynamics. It changes trade positioning. It changes long-term influence. The game is no longer about being the undisputed Asian leader. The game is about maintaining relevance and leverage in a multipolar Asian economic landscape. For China, this comparison is also revealing. It shows how concentrated and powerful certain coastal growth hubs have become. These regions are not just domestic engines. They are global production nodes. Their output reflects integration with global consumption, Western demand, and international capital. Their growth is not isolated. It is deeply tied to the structure of the global economy itself. The deeper lesson is not about Japan versus China. The deeper lesson is about how economic power migrates. It moves toward scale. It moves toward demographic momentum. It moves toward systems that can absorb capital and convert it into output quickly. It rewards countries and regions that can build, export, and reinvest at speed. It punishes stagnation, even when stagnation comes with stability and high living standards. This is why looking only at absolute wealth can be misleading. Japan remains rich, but relative influence depends on comparative growth and comparative scale. In the modern system, being rich is not the same as being dominant. Dominance comes from expansion, from controlling marginal growth, and from shaping where the next $1 trillion of output will be created. As we move deeper into this story, you will see that Japan's shift is not just economic. It is psychological, strategic, and generational. It affects how risk is perceived. It affects how policy is designed. It affects how younger populations see opportunity. And it affects how global investors allocate attention and capital. What looks like a simple map comparison is actually a mirror of a much larger transformation. A transformation where yesterday's center becomes today's stable core, and today's growth engine becomes tomorrow's rule setter. This is not a warning. It is a pattern. And once you see the pattern, You will start seeing it everywhere. Japan's slowdown was not caused by one mistake. It was the result of several powerful forces stacking on top of each other over decades. Each force alone would have been manageable. Together, they formed a structural ceiling on growth. This is why Japan's story is more useful than it looks, because it shows how even highly advanced economies can quietly run into limits that are not easy to break. The first and most unavoidable force is demographics. Japan has one of the oldest populations in the world. The median age is now close to 50. The working age population has been shrinking for years. Fewer workers means fewer total hours worked. Fewer young consumers means weaker domestic demand. Even with high productivity, an economy with a contracting labor base faces a mathematical headwind. Growth becomes harder to sustain, not because people are less capable, but because there are simply fewer people to generate new demand and expansion. At the same time, Japan built a social and economic system designed for stability rather than disruption. Lifetime employment norms, seniority-based wage structures, and strong protection for incumbent firms reduced volatility. This protected social cohesion and prevented mass unemployment. But it also slowed the pace of creative destruction. Startups had a harder time scaling. Risk-taking was culturally and structurally constrained. Innovation continued, but it was more incremental than explosive. In a fast-moving global economy, incrementalism can quietly lose ground to aggressive scaling. Monetary policy became another long-term constraint. After deflation took hold, the Bank of Japan pushed interest rates towards zero and eventually into negative territory. Quantitative easing became permanent policy. These tools prevented collapse and stabilized financial markets, but they also reduced the effectiveness of monetary stimulus over time. When ultra-loose policy becomes the baseline, it loses shock value. Credit flows, but growth does not automatically follow. The system becomes liquid, but not dynamic. Public debt also grew as the government tried to support demand and stabilize the economy. Japan's government debt-to-GDP ratio became the highest among major advanced economies. This was manageable because most debt is held domestically and because interest rates remained extremely low. But high debt limited fiscal flexibility. It narrowed the range of aggressive long-term growth strategies. Policy became more defensive than expansionary. The goal shifted from rapid growth to controlled stability. Now contrast this with what was happening inside China. From the late 1990s onward, China entered a phase of compressed industrialization. Hundreds of millions of people moved from rural areas into cities. Manufacturing capacity expanded at historic speed. Infrastructure investment reshaped logistics, ports, highways, and power grids. Foreign direct investment poured in. Export-led growth created massive scale advantages. Productivity rose not only from technology, but from sheer organizational and logistical optimization across enormous populations. Demographics worked in the opposite direction for China during this phase. China had a large, relatively young workforce for much of its growth surge. This provided a demographic dividend. More workers meant more production. More urban consumers meant expanding domestic demand over time. This created a positive feedback loop. Scale enabled reinvestment. Reinvestment enabled further scale. This is how regional clusters like Jiangsu, Zhejiang, Shanghai, and Fujian became industrial and commercial giants in their own right. Another critical difference was tolerance for disruption. China's growth model accepted, and in some cases encouraged, rapid industrial restructuring. Entire sectors expanded or contracted at speed. Labor mobility was high. Capital was redirected aggressively. The system prioritized output expansion and global market share. This came with social and financial risks, but it also produced speed. In global competition, speed compounds. Japan, by contrast, prioritized continuity. Firms survived longer. Labor markets adjusted more slowly. This reduced social pain but also reduced reallocation speed. Over decades, small differences in speed create large differences in scale. The result is not a dramatic divergence in any single year. The result is a widening gap that only becomes obvious when you compare endpoints, like 1995 versus 2025. There is also a currency layer to this story. Japan's yen weakened significantly over the long term. This supports exports and corporate profits in yen terms, but it also reduces nominal GDP when measured in US dollars. Part of Japan's apparent decline in global rankings reflects exchange rate effects, not just real economic shrinkage. Even so, currency alone cannot explain the magnitude of the shift. The structural growth gap remains the dominant factor. What makes this dynamic uncomfortable is that it is difficult to reverse quickly. You cannot rapidly make a population younger. You cannot instantly rebuild a startup culture at national scale. You cannot easily unwind decades of institutional design optimized for stability. Japan can reform, and it has made efforts in labor markets, immigration policy, and corporate governance. But these are long-term adjustments. They do not produce overnight growth miracles. This is why Japan's case is often studied by other advanced economies. It offers a preview of what happens when aging, low growth, high debt, and ultra-loose monetary policy coexist for decades. It is not a collapse scenario. It is a slow-motion ceiling. A world where maintaining prosperity becomes more important than expanding power. Meanwhile, China's model now faces its own structural limits. Demographics are turning. Debt is rising. Real estate and local government finance pressures are increasing. The very forces that powered growth are now creating new constraints. This means the gap will not widen forever at the same pace. But the accumulated scale difference is already locked in. Those 4 coastal regions have already reached output levels comparable to entire advanced economies. That scale does not disappear easily. The strategic meaning is simple but uncomfortable. Economic leadership is not permanent. It belongs to the phase of development a country is in. Early industrializers dominate early. Late industrializers can overtake in scale. Mature economies stabilize. The map is not a judgment. It is a timeline. In the final part, we will look at what this shift means for the future. Not just for Japan and China, but for how power, opportunity, and influence will likely move in the next 20 years. This is where the implications become personal, because this is where investment, careers, and geopolitical attention will increasingly follow. The most dangerous mistake in economic thinking is to assume that today S rankings define tomorrow S reality. Power does not stay where it is comfortable. It moves toward growth, toward scale, and toward systems that can absorb and deploy capital with the least friction. What happened to Japan is not an exception. It is a preview. And what is happening in China's regional hubs is not a miracle. It is the natural result of momentum meeting opportunity. For Japan, the future is not about reclaiming the past. The era when Japan could dominate Asia by sheer economic mass is over. The new game is precision, not volume. Japan's strength will come from advanced manufacturing, robotics, materials science, semiconductor equipment, and high-end industrial components. These sectors do not always produce explosive GDP growth, but they sit at choke points in global supply chains. Control of choke points creates leverage, even when total size is smaller. This is how smaller but more specialized economies maintain influence in a world dominated by scale players. Germany does this inside Europe. South Korea does this in semiconductors and electronics. Japan is positioned to do this in robotics, machine tools, advanced components, and process technology. The question is not whether Japan will be rich. The question is whether Japan will be strategically indispensable. Those are not the same thing. For China, the next phase is more complex. The coastal growth hubs already carry massive economic weight. But future growth will be harder than past growth. Demographics are no longer supportive. Debt burdens are heavier. Export markets are more politically sensitive. The easy phase of industrial catch-up is largely complete. Now, China must rely more on productivity, innovation, and domestic consumption. That is a different growth model. It is slower, more uncertain, and more exposed to internal policy quality. This is where the comparison with Japan becomes more than symbolic. China is now entering a phase that looks structurally closer to what Japan faced earlier. Aging, slower growth, higher debt. The difference is that China is entering this phase at a much larger absolute scale. That means even slower growth still produces large absolute additions to GDP. But the psychological shift is similar. The narrative will move from miracle growth to managed maturity. Globally, this reshapes how capital flows. Investors chase marginal growth. They follow where the next $1 trillion of output will be created. For much of the past 2 decades, that was clearly China and its surrounding supply chains. Going forward, the picture becomes more fragmented. Southeast Asia, India, parts of Latin America, and selective African markets begin to absorb more attention. The logic is simple. Capital goes where demographics, urbanization, and industrialization are still accelerating. Japan's story becomes a reference case for the advanced world. Europe, South Korea, and eventually parts of China will face similar trade-offs. How do you sustain prosperity when growth slows? How do you remain relevant when others are scaling faster? How do you convert stability into strategic advantage instead of strategic stagnation? These are not academic questions. They shape defense policy, trade agreements, and long-term national strategies. There is also a psychological layer that rarely gets discussed. Nations, like individuals, struggle to adapt their identity when their peak has passed. Japan built its modern identity around economic excellence and industrial leadership. Letting go of dominance while preserving confidence is not easy. The same challenge will eventually face China. When growth normalizes, the story has to change. The system must shift from expansion pride to sustainability discipline. The deeper lesson for viewers is not to bet emotionally on any single country staying on top forever. The modern world rewards flexibility. It rewards understanding where growth is accelerating and where it is stabilizing. If you attach your thinking to yesterday's leader, you miss tomorrow's opportunity. If you understand cycles, you position yourself ahead of them. This is why the 1995 versus 2025 comparison is more than historical trivia. It is a reminder that dominance is temporary, but systems are persistent. Japan built a system optimized for stability. China built a system optimized for scale. Each system wins in different phases of development. The world is now entering a phase where scale still matters, but stability, resilience, and technological choke points matter more than ever. When you zoom out, the map is not just about Japan and 4 Chinese regions. It is about how power quietly migrates from one structure to another. It is about how yesterday's giant becomes today's pillar. It is about how tomorrow's giant is already growing, often in places most people are not paying attention to yet. If you take one thing from this video, let it be this. Economic history does not end. It rotates. The winners change. The logic repeats. Those who understand the rotation early do not just watch history. They position themselves inside it. That is how influence, opportunity, and leverage are built in a world that never stops reordering itself.